Hello folks, MinMax Munchking back. We have the first Unearthed Arcana of 2020. We have the 4 new subclasses, Beast Barbarian, Mercy Monk, Watcher Paladin and the Noble Genie Warlock. So let's explore the mechanics of each and every one. So first on the list is Barbarian, obviously, a path that bears some resemblance to the good old Totem Warrior, at lower levels at least. The path of the Beast is actually quite distinct once you scratch below the surface. The couple origin ideas provided in the table paint the picture of the savage warrior that blends his or her magical ancestry and or primal forces with just raw physicality of the barbarian. Mechanically, it's largely dependent on constitution score, so it kind of introduces a similar type of madness like Storm Herald Barbarian, for example, and seems to be somewhere in the middle in terms of power and playability. Not the best barbarian, but certainly not the worst either. Right, so the level 3 feature, once you get your Path of the Beast form, you gain these 3 types of natural melee weapons you can pick from every time you rage, and these weapons are quite flavorful and turn you into this least gear dependent character of all. However, most tables and DMs allow feats, and this subclass is problematic in a way that this particular feature doesn't synergize with common barbarian go-to feats like Great Weapon Master, for instance. Nevertheless, Bite seems to be quite potent on lower levels, turning you into one of the hardest barbarians to take down, but the minor regeneration definitely doesn't scale well at all into higher tiers, even with maxed out constitution modifier. I think the damage die should be bumped up to 1d10 at least, or the regeneration could be improved to maybe 2 times constitution modifier at higher levels, something like that. Now claws are actually very good for stacking rage damage, especially on low levels, but the damage die itself is underwhelming and could also be bumped all the way up to 1d8 at least, in my opinion. Now tail does have a nice damage die, 1d12, and the extra reach is a nice benefit, oftentimes probably helping you reach some of the enemies farther away from you, but it's not like it synergizes with, let's say, Polar Master for bonus action attack either, so it just feels underwhelming. It goes back to that incompatibility with the best feats for most barbarians in the game. This one sadly doesn't get to benefit from them if he or she wants to use subclass features, right? Now, Storm Herald Barbarian, he has these auras, they get damage improvements at higher levels, so I don't see why these weapons, right, Bite, Claws and Tail, wouldn't get progressively better and better in terms of damage. Maybe adding half or even full proficiency bonus to their damage at some point later, you know, at higher levels, seeing how you legitimately cannot combine this subclass with feats to optimize for damage. Now, based on my poll that I posted on my community page tab on this channel some time ago, some like 2-3% of people play without feats. Now, granted, this is a small sample size, but it just leaves me to believe that most people play with feats, and if you play this particular subclass, if your DM allows Unearthed Arcana, I think you just won't be able to optimize for damage as well as pretty much every other barbarian out there in the open, right? At level 6 you get this Bestial Soul feature, which, you know, the subclass does suffer from a bit lower damage per round because of the fact you can't take these feats, but the fact you get magic weapons at level 6 is a redeeming quality, especially at higher levels when more and more monsters get damage resistances. Now, monks, arcane archer fighter, moon druids, couple other subclasses as well, all get similar magical damage features around these levels, like level 6-7. So there's already precedent in the game for that, and I don't think it would be overpowered or anything. But you also get an added mobility buff that you get to pick and choose after every short rest, right? Or maybe long rest. This matches your bestial essence even more and definitely will help you be more flexible in changing adventuring environments. It's always better to have that because sometimes you just deal with these terrains and environments where you have to account for those, right? At level 10 you get Infectious Fury, a solid feature with double constitution score dependency for both the saving throw DCs and the number of uses per long rest. It introduces that madness, like the multiple ability score dependency. However, most of the best barbarian feats are out of the question, as I've already said before, so you're pretty much free to use your ability score improvements to improve your ability scores. So the first option, the target who makes a reaction and makes attack against another creature on a fail, might be situationally, and definitely can be situationally, super powerful, depending on the damage the affected target typically outputs with its melee attacks. Even better, you get to burn the target's reaction, so if you or any of your allies want to move away, that movement won't trigger attack of opportunity, or maybe if you're dealing with an enemy spellcaster, it won't be able to cast counterspell against your party members' spells. In either case, burning your enemy's reaction is usually a good thing, so this is definitely very, very useful in that regard. Now, based on the wording, you only get to choose which creature gets attacked, not necessarily the most powerful melee options. So this, I believe, still leaves enough room for the DM to minimize the damage that the creature affected by this effect would be dealing to some other creature, right? Now, if you're just going for damage, which is a valuable, always a valuable thing to do, it's probably better to pick the second option, because it's only dependent on one roll, a wisdom save, compared to the first option, which also, on top of the wisdom save, requires an attack roll. So, depending on what you need, you just have to pick and choose, just be mindful of these. Yes, burning a reaction is good, but do you need to burn a reaction? Do you just need a bit more damage? In that case, go for the second option, which just deals psychic damage. In either case, chances are you might force the target to burn one or more of its legendary resistances, further helping your party spellcaster do their thing. This is especially true at higher levels when more and more monsters have these legendary resistances, legendary saves. So at level 10, it's fairly common to encounter some of those, especially in like boss fights. So this feature will definitely come in handy. At level 14, you gain your basically last subclass feature, called the Hunt. Another feature that uses Constitution modifier for two things, number of targets and number of uses per long rest. Its power and viability do depend a lot on your party's composition, maybe a bit too much, and also how many players are at the table at the end of the day. Giving another Barbarian in your party and a Paladin reckless attack can be a devastating party buff that can easily snowball in an encounter in your party's favor with just one or two timely critical hits, or even if they don't, if the targets of this effect don't land critical hits, they still have better odds of actually hitting the targets. So, always improving the odds of hitting is what martial classes need, right? So just giving them reckless attack is really, really good team play feature. On the other hand, if you are the only melee character and the party is made of largely ranged based or maybe spellcasting characters like Rogue, Ranger, Wizard, or maybe Sorcerer, Warlock, who knows, this feature is really kind of severely diminished in terms of effectiveness and power, because let's say 25 temporary hit points won't really last long, most likely, even if you have more. And especially with non-physical damage types that are pretty common at higher levels, you will lose those temporary hit points pretty fast. And advantage against frightened condition is only good if your mental saving throws are good to begin with, which is most likely not the case. At least that's not the case in terms of like most barbarians. Now yes, you can take resilient wisdom or resilient charisma. That's often the thing that barbarians take to have a bit easier time succeeding on some of those saves, but still you probably dumped those ability scores, so frightened condition comes usually after failing mental saving throws, and those are for most barbarians again bad, so I don't really think it's gonna be that much useful to you, right? Not to mention that Berserker Barbarian, which is like a old PHB Barbarian, gets the immunity to frightened condition while raging, starting all the way down from level 6, and you pretty much get only advantage. So, when you compare, this feature is really like the best when you have a bunch of melee characters in a party who use strength for their attacks. Paladins, barbarians, strength fighters, even rogues maybe, usually dex, but maybe a moon druid, who knows, like just everybody who uses strength for attacks, giving them reckless attack is really good, really good, I think. But again, it depends on the party composition, obviously. Way of the Mercy Monk, a monk that heals, isn't a new thing, at least in terms of Unearthed Arcana. All the way back in 2016, there was a monk Unearthed Arcana that introduced Kensei and Tranquility subclasses. Kensei received minor modifications and has gone on to become official in Xanatar's Guide to Everything, but there are probably several good reasons why Tranquility, which is basically a monk with 2 times more powerful lay on hands, hasn't become official. Now, Mercy Monk doesn't steal anything from Paladin, and its features fit the core class more neatly, but it still looks considerably more powerful compared to other monk subclasses. Implements of Mercy feature gives you basically 3 extra proficiencies, and this does make this a bit better than your typical subclass thematic ribbon feature, which usually gives you like 1 or 2 proficiencies. Insight is usually more useful skill proficiency, but medicine is thematically fitting skill for this particular subclass, so both make sense. I would pretty much go for Insight any day, if you ask me. Both tool proficiencies can be equally viable in both wilderness exploration and even urban settings, full of mysteries and intrigue. You know, maybe somebody was poisoned, or you know, you need to figure out who was giving some poisonous mushrooms. Who knows? Like, Herbalism Kit and Poisoner's Kit can help you even in less wilderness open world campaigns. More like urban mystique, intrigue, mysteries, detective work. Who knows? Like, it could be useful in that regard as well. Depends on the circumstances, obviously. Hands of the Healing is in my opinion, hands down, fully pun intended, the single most powerful secondary healing feature in the game. What do I mean by that? It's basically a healing word, cure wounds, let's call it permanent feature that you can use as many times as you have key points left. Sure, at level 3 you only have 3 key points, and therefore you can only use it 3 times, but you get to use it with the bonus action for free if you use Flurry of Blows. So your cleric or your druid can cast Healing Word using their bonus action, but that's pretty much it. You get a similar effect, you know, rolling 1d4, 1d6 plus your wisdom modifier, so basically the same thing. But on top of that, with Flurry of Blows, you can also deal a bit more damage. So at level 3, this is quite potent. And obviously, as you keep leveling up, keep getting more key points, you combine this feature with the fact that you have a lot of movement speed as a monk, and key points also recharge after a short rest. So let's say level 10, you have 10 key points. You short rest, you gain all of them back. You burn all of them on healing, you gain all of them back at the end of the short rest. Your party will rarely have to worry about being above 0 hit points. Let's just say that you can't heal as much, and maybe, you know, in terms of how many hit points, but you have so many hit points and they recharge after a short rest, and like you have movement speed, you can get to the people, you can deal damage, you can heal. This is quite potent. Now, Hands of Harm, another level 3 feature, is kind of like the opposite. Instead of healing your party members, you deal more damage to the enemies, right? On its own, this feature looks kind of pricey in terms of key points expenditure, and maybe you're thinking, oh, when's the target going to be incapacitated or poisoned? But when you consider the fact that monks get a core feature that enables you to stun enemies starting from level 5, 1 key point for 3 dice worth of extra necrotic damage suddenly sounds way more appealing. And as if that stun locking mechanic wasn't enough on its own, just 1 level more into this monk subclass gives you Noxious Aura, which granted costs 1 key point to activate as well, but it requires a bonus action, therefore sort of tying neatly into your action economy, lasts a full minute, and all creatures within 5 feet of you have to succeed on con saves, constitution saving throws at the start of their turn, or get poisoned. So you don't even necessarily have to burn key points on stunning the targets, you just activate the aura, wait until the enemy probably inevitably fails a saving throw at some point, and then smash it with a boatload of necrotic damage via your Hands of Harm. So the combination of these two features, the damage it produces, doesn't scale into higher levels nearly as well as the amount of healing you can do with the Hands of Healing. But a lot of monsters are immune to poison condition, and the aura does affect your allies. So if you're not careful, and you can still burn through your pool of key points too quickly, but if you play your cards right, you can mess up a lot of monsters' days with this potent combination of features, right? I mean, most monks kind of like flatline in terms of damage after level 5. You sort of flatline in terms of damage in a similar fashion, but you do deal a little bit more damage, especially after you hit some higher levels, and therefore you don't really have to worry about spending one key point on this aura. So you just activate it, let it work passively, and once the enemy fails a saving throw, you can kind of like burn additional key points and deal a crap ton of damage. Don't forget that your martial arts damage die also improves as you level up, so at some point it will become a d6, d8, d10, right? Depending on how high you go. So this will definitely keep getting better and better incrementally as you level up. Healing technique at level 11, hit points at higher levels in general become less of an issue, so your Hands of Healing can now fix 4 nasty conditions as well. Paralysis is easily the most dangerous one, but blinded and poison can be annoying as well. Deafened condition rarely sees use, at least in my experience, right? And even if it does, it's only a minor inconvenience in most cases, at least. And compared to other level 11 monks, this isn't too crazy. But due to how support-oriented this subclass is, it further expands its very helpful team play cooperative arsenal, right? At level 17 you get a feature that's, in most cases, you know, it can be used to cheaply and effortlessly burn through the enemy's legendary resistances, if any. Maybe you are facing too many foes, so just temporarily placing one of them, a powerful one, on a timeout, you know, quote unquote, can significantly shift the combat flow in your party's favor. And even outside of combat, if the circumstances are right, you can plan ahead, maybe thinking a bit outside of the box. You can use this feature effectively if the circumstances allow. For example, you can use this on an overthrown king to convince his enemies he is no longer a problem, only to come a few days later, get the king out of his resting spot, right? Permanent resting spot, quote and quote, smuggle the king out of the kingdom, help him plot the future revenge, while everybody thinks the king is dead 6 feet under. Not entirely sure what would happen if somebody casts Speak with Dead on the said king, but that's the problem for a DM to solve anyway, so let's move on, right? Next we have the Paladin. Oath of the Watchers is a more team play support oriented subclass, which sort of appears to be a theme with these 3 subclasses that we've talked about and are about to talk a bit more about. So the mechanics strongly support the theme of a character that's sworn to protect and guard the material world from harmful extraplanar creatures and influences. However, the features might be just a tad too dependent on the types of creatures you're dealing with. Therefore, knowing in advance what types of enemies you'll be dealing with during the campaign and which plane of existence it's going to take place in is something you might have to legitimately discuss with the DM if you don't want to feel like you're completely out of place. Oath spells, which all paladins get at level 3 once they take their oaths, are a couple, there are a couple of really good spells on the Watcher Paladins list, and let's go over those really quickly. So Alarm isn't as useful because paladins don't have ritual casting, but if you don't, if you need an extra layer of protection during long rests, it can be handy. Chromatic Orb is a very potent range damage spell at lower levels specifically, and gives you an alternative fallback option if you can't get in melee for whatever reason, which might actually happen. Augury is another utility that's slightly worse because you cannot cast it as a ritual, but it's often a fun little spell, the way of squeezing a bit more info out of your DM. Moonbeam is a solid area of effect option for a class that often struggles against groups of enemies. Counterspell is probably the best spell on the list, and it significantly improves your readiness to deal with enemy spellcasters. This kind of makes this subclass the best paladin to deal with spellcasters, period. Non-detection is situational by default, so if you or another party member do need to fly under the radar for a bit, it will come up. Otherwise, it's probably just gonna be something that you rarely ever even think about. Dealing with condition effects becomes more common at higher levels, so getting Aura of Purity for free, a spell that you would likely prepare anyway, makes it that much more flexible in terms of spell selection for you specifically. Banishment is one of the best level 4 control spells in the game, and it's only slightly worse on a half-caster like Paladin, due to Paladins having, needing to be higher level to get it, and also they have less higher level spell slots to use on Banishment. Hold Monster, sort of similar, it's definitely awesome in its pure form, and, especially when dealing with tough boss fights, even though it takes a while to get it, you need 17 levels in this class, and, and use it. Hollow, whatever it's pronounced, is one of those spells that requires specific circumstances to fall into place for it to be even useful, but in a high-level campaign, once you reach level 17 involving a lot of relevant creature types and unique scenarios, you might just be able to stack the odds in your favor here and there, depending on what you know in advance. It's too, there's too many variables, I can't really know for sure, but it's something you get for free, so why not, right? Channel Divinities, it's just a standard feature that Paladins get to use once per short rest. You gain 2 options. The first one, Watcher's Will, probably won't be as useful on lower levels, but once you hit the double digits, and maybe even a little bit before, mental saving throws will become more prevalent, and giving your party advantage on those is a very, very potent buff. It's also another good reason to max out your charisma score as soon as possible, on top of the usual like Aura of Protection and all the other stuff. Abjure the Extra Planar gives you access to same mechanics sort of that the Cleric's Turn Undead Channel Divinity has, but instead of targeting undead, it works against 4 creature types that are often encountered in all sorts of settings and campaigns. Now, depending on the campaign, it's probably a bit better at higher levels, but you can encounter a devil or a coven of hags on lower levels too, so it will see some use across all tiers of character progression, unless maybe you're playing in a humanoid-only campaign, there's no monsters. That's why, again, I will reiterate that you talk with the DM, ask him whether there's even gonna be any elementals, fays, fiends, or those types of creatures. If not, better play some other paladin to begin with. Aura of Sentinel, level 7 and obviously level 18 improvement, like it's usually the case with these level 7 auras and all auras that paladins get. As a protector of mortal material domains, it makes sense for you to be able to act and help others act faster in combat, but most characters don't actually benefit too much from a bit higher initiative roll. If the DM constantly drops monsters that inflict annoying condition effects, or maybe just deal ridiculous amounts of damage even at higher levels, getting to act before them might matter, but even then initiative order is usually way too random for a feature like this to offer any consistent, meaningful benefit. Let's say maybe you have +5 to charisma, but if if you roll 1 on the initiative, you still have like, 9, 10 at most, like who knows. So, it's just way too random and inconsistent, so it's just a hit or miss. Of course, if there is an assassin rogue specifically, and maybe a couple of other subclasses that do get to benefit from their initiative, he or she will most likely stick to you like a super glue, otherwise it's kind of like, whatever. Vigilant Rebuke, a level 15 feature obviously, is a bit, a free extra damage on a reaction, kind of nice, but it's behind several circumstances you have no control over. First, you might be dealing with a non-spellcaster, so this becomes useless to begin with. Second, maybe the spellcaster is targeting an ally that isn't within 30 feet of you, a common occurrence at higher levels. Third, maybe the target simply fails a saving throw. I think personally, in my opinion at least, this last prerequisite should be removed and the feature should trigger whenever you or a creature nearby are subjected to any saving throw against any spell, maybe even against any magical effect. That's open to discussion. Let me know in the comments down below, maybe you don't agree with me. But regardless of whether the saving throw has failed or succeeded, it should trigger. That's at least the way I see it. The damage isn't massive to begin with, it uses your reactions, so it cannot be abused, and I see no reason why not to buff it just slightly, right? Level 20 capstone feature, Mortal Bulwark, bonus action, 1 minute duration capstone, kind of standard for these types of Paladin level 20 features. True Sight is probably the most consistent buff, because darkness and other visibility issues are to be expected at level 20. Advantage against the same 4 creature types that you can deal with your channel divinities and other things is situational by default again, but if you're playing out of the Abyss, for example, it's great, but it won't help much in Storm King's Thunder, for example. Banishing any type of extraplanar creature back into its native realm is a bit more consistent. You might just have to fight Celestials or even some Modrons or constructs from Mechanus, but it still depends on the type of creature and its plane of origin for it to even work. And yeah, I mean, you can use it only once a day. I think the subclass as a whole is kind of a bit too much dependent on the type of campaign creatures, you know, DM, who knows. So maybe if your DM just decides to put monsters that these features do nothing against, you're pretty much gonna be relegated to the status of ordinary generic paladin without any special powers, right? Noble Genie, a Warlock whose patron offers a couple of juicy spells to learn. The Fog Cloud and Sleep are very potent control spells at lower levels. They both lose potency later on. For Warlocks, it's not really a problem because it's almost expected you discard some of the lower level spells in favor of these higher level ones as you keep progressing through the class. Enlarge Reduce isn't the best buff for martial classes, but a large barbarian is always fun to have around, and there are ways for this, there are ways to use this spell outside of combat as well, depending on the circumstances. Phantasmal Force can be amazing in the hands of a creative player and out-of-the-box thinkers, but by default it suffers from the common downside most illusion spells face. DM interpretation, right? That your DM might just say, oh well, it's an illusion, doesn't matter. Create food and water isn't something I'd worry about as a Warlock, but if survival is at the forefront of your party's troubles, at least you don't have to call for a cleric to save the day. Protection from energy requires knowledge in advance and is rarely useful in practice. This is one of those spells that I kind of never liked and I would pretty much never learn or prepare it. However, if you do play in some of those campaigns that you do have some of the knowledge in advance, it actually might be useful. But again, I would probably never learn it. And I wouldn't advise it as one of the options to think about. Now, Polymorph is definitely a very good both a buff spell for an ally or even a debuff legendary resistance burner spell against enemies. Now, granted, you don't have as many slots, so it's kind of like you have to time and think about when to cast it, but still, just turning your ally into a T-Rex or a Great Ape is a very, very good thing. It's like just a pool of hit points at the very least. Phantasmal Killer is another illusion, right? But its effect is more mechanical in nature and doesn't rely on DM's interpretation as much. However, immunity to frightened condition is common as well, so it can often bite you in the rear depending on the type of monster you're dealing with. Big Beast's Hand is a top tier spell on its own and probably the best spell on this expanded list overall. Even though you can't cast it at the higher level because, you know, you only have 5th level spells, the 4 modes it operates at allow for plenty of flexibility when faced with various dangerous situations on the battlefield and even outside of combat. Creation, finally, is interesting in combination with Warlock's short rest spell slots. You can definitely manage without it, but if you're into illusions and using spells and magic in very creative, out-of-the-box ways, this is one of the best spells for it. Collector's Vessel is on the surface, you know, it kind of best pairs with Pact of the Chain Boon at level 3, because you can just use it on your familiar that you get from the Pact of the Chain. However, the bonus to perception is always useful, while the flexibility of casting spells from the invisible imp sounds borderline game breaking depending on your spell choices and depending on the circumstances and to some extent party composition. While it isn't clearly defined what would happen in such a case, as most invisible creatures do lose invisibility once they do anything, the wording leads me to believe that, or at least strongly implies that, it is still you who cast and deliver these spells, and you only use these tethered creatures passively. You use their position, not their, they don't have to do anything, as a proxy for better positioning, more flexibility in terms of where and how you cast the spells. Elemental resistance is sort of decent, kind of nice, but the power is highly dependent on the DM and the type of campaign you're playing. If you're playing out of the Abyss, for example, fire and cold are always safe bets, because you will most likely deal with one or the other. But, if dealing with Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage, where you might be dealing with all sorts of things, it might not come up, as often, and, choosing the damage type will definitely make sense. Otherwise, it's a hit and miss in most cases, unless you can gain enough clues in advance to know what types of damage you might be dealing with during the following adventuring day. Now, at level 10 you gain your Protective Wish, which basically protects your Pact of the Chain familiars or squishy casters getting bombarded by a bloodthirsty DM. Nothing too fancy, just very simple feature. Maybe some minor battlefield control utility, maybe, again, but it kind of falls in a similar fashion of protecting your allies and putting yourself in a position of taking some hurt. Depends on what you have to deal with, but I would definitely consider this as a very good thing to keep particularly your Pact of the Chain familiars up, because those do die very, very easily, especially at later levels. Genie's Entertainment is a very, very flavorful feature that's quite potent mechanically. The control capability is similar to the Banishment spell, and it's situationally superior because it cannot be counterspelled, right? It's not really a spell to begin with. On the flip side, it's only a once per day feature that you can't upcast with higher level slots. However, Warlocks cap out at 5th level slots anyway, so you're not losing much in that sense, while potentially gaining a lot more in return, depending on what enemies you're dealing with. So it will definitely come up. You will definitely need and want to use this if you play a 10th level Genie Warlock. Finally, at level 14, Collector's Call, another flavorful feature with 3 options that are all quite effective. The first one is kind of selective mix of lay on hands, lesser, greater restoration that have range instead of touch. It's very good. First, you just, healing somebody. It's always good. So even though you're not a healer, if it's a do or die situation, it might matter. And blinded, charmed, deafened, frightened, paralyzed, and poisoned are conditions you often deal with, even earlier on, and definitely at level 14 and above. The second one can be super effective when dealing with legendary resistances, less so against attack rolls in my opinion. The last one's utility is better suited for prolonged campaigns with established lores and fleshed out storylines, but divination spells can always be useful to an extent, especially when you are desperately trying to get more info and clues out of your DM. Even in one-shots where you play for a couple of hours and then you forget about it, it still might actually come up, depending on obviously if you even play a high-level one-shots. The additional gold sync potential, with or without the DM providing in-world options and venues for such activities, it's kind of cool thematic way to use the resource that often uselessly piles up at higher levels. It's not uncommon to have thousands of gold just laying around and you don't even get to spend it. So out of all of these subclasses, I think even that the Genie Warlock is kind of the most flavorful. That's just obviously subjective opinion, but yeah, I definitely like the theme, the flavor. Mechanics sound cool. Definitely nothing seems to be overpowered, nothing seems to be overly underpowered either. It just seems balanced. Not the best, not the worst, right? Now, I do have one thing to ask from you, and that is to go down below and murder hobo that like button absolutely destroy it, and while you're at it, why not just banish that subscribe button as well, and bang the bell to get notified of all my future videos that I upload to this channel. Special shout out to all of my patrons: Mike, Matthew, Ewing, Larry Hocken, BardlyManHardlyTrying, Rogor, Kaleron, SuburbanHell, Arbet, Kwak, Aidan Harth, Gary Kors, Oldham, Joel C Alcazar, Bredwin, Yaboy Fox, Sean, Mannozzi Stefano, Adekoya, bittenbi, Jeremy, Sirois, Inácio Neto, Anthony Du, Lunatic Dragon, Zack McNemar, Darth Xín, Dis Garcia, Ebonhawk, CrackedMask, Red MC, and Markley Sim. Thank you for your continued support. If you are still watching this video and you don't see your name on this list, there is going to be linked down below in the description to my Patreon page, so if you're interested, go check it out. There are these tiers that you can pledge to get these special perks, mostly the PDFs and Word files that I use in all of my videos, sort of like the guides, the the leveling guides, the feature guides, spell guides. So go check it out if you want to support me, if you think I'm worth the trouble, right? And that's pretty much it. Min Max Munchkin out, and talk to you soon.